All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Happy to welcome back to the show, friend of the show, Simon Rosenberg. He is a strategist. He is a commentator. You can find him at hopiumchronicles.com. Simon Rosenberg, welcome back.
Great to be here, man. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Great to talk with you. And I feel like this is our just regularly scheduled check-in where you take my blood pressure, tell me everything's okay.
Yeah.
But it does seem like, okay, let me just back up for I think most people know who you are.
Yeah, sure.
But you're somebody who has been very right about Democrats and Joe Biden specifically winning in 2020, Democrats doing better than all the so-called experts thought in 2022. And you've been on the show a few times in this cycle. And every time you basically say you'd rather be us than them, meaning if you had to pick, you'd rather be on Team Biden than Team Trump, despite what the polls and the pundits are saying.
Yep.
And with that, I want to play a Harry Enten from CNN. This is a couple weeks old. It's after that New York Times Siena poll. It's about a minute long. I want to play this and get your response on the other end.
Have a divide between the Sun Belt and Great Lake battleground states, all right? You know, these are all 6 states that Joe Biden won last time around. They won it by the closest margin of any of the states he won. Look, these Sun Belt battleground states, frankly, for the Joe Biden campaign, these numbers are an absolute disaster. The smallest lead is in Arizona for Donald Trump. He's up 6. Look at this, 9 in Georgia, 13 in Nevada. My goodness gracious, my God. That is a huge lead. No Democrat has lost that state since John Kerry lost it back in 2004. How about these Great Lake battleground states? This is something that the Joe Biden campaign can work with. Look, Pennsylvania, Donald Trump up 3, but that's well within the margin of error. Wisconsin, Donald Trump up 1, well within the margin of error. And actually, a Joe Biden lead well within the margin of error, up a point here. This they can work with the Joe Biden campaign. This, the Donald Trump campaign, absolutely loves, and it looks like a lot of the other polling on the Sun Belt battleground. I mean, it's advantage Donald Trump, but he's not over the 270 mark just yet, all right? So
anyway, what do you make of that?
Let me tell you where I think the race is, right? Is that I think the race is very close. I think that, we've probably gained a point or two over the last couple months. You've seen it both in the poll, the polling averages this month, national polls. There have been more polls with Biden ahead than with Trump ahead. And we've actually had a series of polls showing Biden ahead by 3, 4, 5 points, including the other New York Times poll, which had, they did a second poll, which had Biden ahead by 3 points. And in the battleground states, I think the fair way to look at what we've seen is that in the last 3, battleground state polls that had multiple states, all 3 of them had the Emerson poll, the CBS poll, and the New York Times likely voter data, not the registered voter data, which is what they were referring to there, but the likely voter data was all of those came within margin of error in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which means that Donald Trump is not winning the election. He's not leading the election. He's not ahead. It's just close and competitive. And I think people have to be, I also think there's no one on our side who believes that we're down by large margins in those 3 other states. I mean, we may not be ahead, but I don't think the idea that we're down in a state that's been 1 to 2 points for every election in many, many years is somehow he's opened up a double-digit lead. It's not real. And so I think that we're in the way I view it right now is the election is close and competitive. Neither candidate is winning. Neither candidate is where they want to be. And both have a lot of work to do to go win the election. And as you pointed out, and for reasons we'll discuss, over the next 5.5 months, I'd much rather be us than them. And I think we have a much higher likelihood of winning than they do.
So, one of the things that happened on the heels of this polling is that Joe Biden's team said, in effect, they don't believe it, or that there's more context.
So can I just add 2 basic things about polling? And Tom Bonnier and I just did a call, and we've agreed to finally write something about this, because there are 2 basic admonitions or sort of advice I want to give everybody about polling right now. One is that polling is not as accurate as it's being portrayed. The way to think about polling is that it's more like a impressionist painting of a moment, not a photograph. And when you then have 20 impressionist paintings, you get to a place where things are very blurry, right? Where they're hard to know. I think this idea that there is an answer, or the polls are saying one thing, or that you can get to a level of accuracy based on any one individual poll or a series of polls, I think is inaccurate. It's a misunderstanding of the nature of the data that has this high degree of margin of error built in, right? Meaning that, if you're at 46%, you could either be at 50 or at 42. And we're asking, so rather than sort of acknowledging that and acknowledging the level of that we're exaggerating the level of accuracy of polling, we're sort of pushing polling and the data beyond what it can really do. The second thing is that, and this is what is going to be the basis of a piece I'm going to start writing this afternoon, is that we have to do a better job, I think, acknowledging the tension in the data. Meaning that, when you have a CNN poll that has Biden down 6 nationally and an ABC poll that has him up 5, there's tension there, right? Those are describing two completely different elections. And you can't resolve that tension by averaging them. Because if you take a poll that's +6 Trump and a poll that's +5 Biden, one is saying that Trump is winning outside margin of error. The other one is saying Biden is winning. If you average them, it says neither of them is winning. And that's not what either poll says, right? So now you've created a method of reconciling the tension in the data that actually creates an inaccurate understanding of what either poll says, and clearly is something that cannot actually be true. And I know this is a little bit esoteric, but I think that there's a bigger problem here, which is that people are operating as if 5.5 months out, where their polls are all over the place, right? And there's lots of Republican polls in these averages, that somehow the race sits in one place as opposed to being a broad range of possibilities, right? And so the election is, I think the most accurate way to describe it is that it's close and competitive, and neither side is winning or leading right now. And that we have to do a better job, I think, in the media, particularly CNN in particular. That CNN, they were talking about New York Times and Siena, but CNN has been doing a lot of analysis of their most recent poll and pulling out the demographics without acknowledging that their poll was considered to be a dramatic outlier by most folks. It was +6 Trump. There have been literally 24 polls taken during the same period showing the race, 1 point here, 2 points there, And so their poll was an outlier. And then to use that as the basis of a set of analytical products, when we know it's running at odds with all this other data without acknowledging the tension in the data, is, a little bit reckless in my view, and I think we all need to be better. I think that, as a former journalist and someone who worked at ABC News and grew up in the media and news business, I think it would be best if commentators did a better job at acknowledging the tension in the data. That's how part of the way, Matt, and I'm going on a long time here, but it's part of how I got things right in 2022. And let me just explain this really quickly. In 2022, there was all this independent polling showing the election close and competitive. And then there were these very Republican polls that were usually funded by Republican pollsters or organizations that showed the election 3 to 4 points more Republican. And if you averaged those, you ended up with the race being +2, +3 Republican. If you disaggregated them and pulled them apart and pushed the Republican polls out, you ended up where I was, where the election was close and competitive and Republicans did not have an advantage. And the same thing is beginning to happen in this election. There's now, like, the bulk of independent national polls have the race very close or even Biden slightly ahead. And then there are these very Republican polls, again, that are pushing and pulling the averages to a place that I think is distorting the actual nature of this election. Remember, Real Clear Politics ended up based on averages, with Republicans getting to 54 seats in the Senate in 2022. Clearly, that wasn't accurate, right? And so using averages as a way to sort of approximate where things are, it can work. It also can produce results that are wildly wrong, like Real Clear Politics was in 2022, and like I think they are literally every day of this election as well.
All right, I got a bunch of questions, but
yeah,
since you've kind of brought up the CNN and some of the specific demographics, let me just play this. This will be the last clip I think I play. Also Harry
I think
Ensign.
I'll be okay with. I think I'll be okay with this.
But I'm wondering if this is what you're referring to just now, but we could talk about it on the other end.
Sure.
But look at this number for Donald Trump, 22%. Where was Donald Trump at this point 4 years ago in the polls? He was just at 9% of the vote. So he's seen more than a doubling in his support among African Americans. This margin, which was in the 70s just 4 years ago, look at where it is now, 69 minus 22. That puts it in the 40s. My goodness gracious. If this held through the general election, obviously we're still months away, this would be by far the best performance for a Republican candidate among black voters in a generation, 2 generations, probably since 1960 and Richard Nixon against John F. Kennedy. That's how long we're really talking about when we're looking at this margin here. This could be a truly historic margin. It's quite a troubling sign for the Biden campaign.
What do you make of that?
Nobody on our side believes any of that. I mean, and Biden may not be where he was, but let me give you an example, right, of this, of how this stuff gets challenging for a rational person to kind of make sense of all the noise here, right? So the New York Times Siena polls, the ones that created the big disturbance in the forest last week, had Trump winning in the battlegrounds among 18 to 29-year-olds by a point. Right? In the Harvard Institute of Politics quarterly survey of 18 to 29-year-olds, which is considered to be the gold standard youth poll, which was 2,000 interviews just of 18 to 29-year-olds, Biden's ahead by 19 points. So the New York Times poll had him winning young people, and the poll that is considered to be the gold standard, that has large numbers of interviews, shows something completely different. What would be responsible in the future would be for a publication like the New York Times to acknowledge the tension, to acknowledge that there's other high quality, frankly, much higher quality polling being done in other places that shows something completely different, and that we don't really know where things really are. The problem is that would make the New York Times poll less authoritative if they did that, if they acknowledged that there were other polls that are serious, credible, independent polls showing something completely different. I'll give you another example just on the youth piece. Pew did a 7,000 person sample national poll, meaning that the subgroups or the demographic groups are much more accurate, right? Because if you do an 800 person sample or 1,000 person, you're talking about margin of error with subgroups at 10%, 12%. So these larger polls that are 5, 6, 7, 8,000 interviews, their subgroups tend to be much more accurate. They just released their findings, 7,000 person national interviews. Biden was up 21 points with 18 to 29-year-olds, right? The New York Times had Trump ahead by a point. What's the answer? Well, we don't know, right? We actually don't know. I mean, there's tension in the data, and acknowledging the tension in the data is what gets you to a place of understanding. And what the New York Times did last week, and I want to be very clear about this, because I think the longer we've had to sit with what the Times did last week, the harder it is to understand. The New York Times basically last week had 3 sets of data. They had registered voters, likely voters in their battleground state polls, and then they had a national poll they did that was separate, done by a different pollster. In the registered voter or the battleground polls, Trump is ahead in 5 out of 6 states. He's winning the election, or he's leading in the election. I don't like to say winning because we're too far away from anyone to be winning or losing at this point. But he's ahead, and he's ahead in the battleground. So if the election were held today in that poll, he would win, right? In likely voters, he's not ahead in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and Biden's doing far better. And so therefore, he's not winning any one of those 3 states. So therefore, Biden actually wins, right, in that model. And then in the third set of data, Biden's actually ahead by 3 points nationally, presenting a completely different set of data than these other 2 polls done at the same time by a different pollster. In that polling, Biden's winning the election, right? So one, Trump's winning. The other one, Biden has a slight advantage. The other one, Biden's got a significant advantage. The New York Times chose to go with one of those 3 data sets as their structural understanding of what was happening, which is that Trump was winning in 5 out of 6 states. That was an editorial decision. The data wasn't driving that decision. Somebody made that decision to pick one of the 3 to sort of lead with. And when the New York Times puts, Trump ahead in 5 out of 6 states, it gets a little bit of attention, right? The problem with that is that in the other 2 sets of data they had, the polling didn't find that. And what would have been more responsible would have been for the Times to have acknowledged the tension in the data in their own polling, which they didn't do. And in fact, they barely even reported on this other independent national poll they did that showed Biden ahead by 3 points, which, by the way, is a completely different election than what was being presented in the battleground state polls. I'm sure that all of your listeners and viewers are completely confused now, because it is confusing. And I think that part of what's happening is that in this age where clicks and attention matters so much, responsible media organizations, I think, are making really iffy decisions about how they're presenting this stuff, because this stuff must get a lot of clicks and must make them a lot of money. I'll point out 3 organizations that have done a good job in managing this. One is the Washington Post. They had a poll last year where the data they got back was very at odds with other public polling, and they acknowledged that in the writing of the article. They acknowledged, here's our polling, here's what other people are seeing. There's a tension in the data. They acknowledged that. ABC took responsibility, for what happened in 2022, and by getting rid of Nate Silver, frankly, right, and acknowledged that there have been problems with the polling and the data in the election. And then the New York Times did a very good job. They wrote a front page story in December of 2022, an investigative piece looking into what happened with the red wave and why everybody got it wrong. So there has been some accountability, and there are ways to do this responsibly. I think that what I'm going to be doing in my public commentary, and this may be nerdy and boring the hell out of everybody, is that I'm going to really try to challenge commentators to do something very simple, which is just to acknowledge the tension in the data that exists. When data is not all pointing in the same direction, you have to acknowledge that in order to get to truth. If you ignore it or obscure it or cover it up, you're starting to get to a place of misrepresentation, right? And there is a lot of tension in the data right now in national polling. I mean, I've been, just in the last few days, there were polls showing Biden ahead by 5 and Trump ahead by 6. What do you do with that, right? Well, we don't know. What it means is things are soft. We got a long election ahead of us. The way I'd like to describe it, Matt, is that, we're at the end of the first quarter of a basketball game and the game's tied, and most of the game's ahead of us, and we're the higher seed in the tournament than Trump, right? Biden's a higher seed. Does that mean we're going to win? No. Does it make it more likely that we win? Yes. And that's where my head is at about where the election is at this point.
Aside from my blood pressure, does it matter what commentators say? Is it a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Yeah, no, it does, because what happens is that it affects money. It affects volunteers. It affects it affects the family, right? It impacts. It's why did we learn this week that Trump paid Michael Cohen to fix a poll, right? Where they hired they bought fake IP addresses to go lobby a poll online, because this stuff shapes people's understandings. And, it's our belief in 2022 that the false reporting of the red wave cost us the House. And the reason we believe that is because at the end, there was a whole lot of money the DCCC was supposed to get that went elsewhere because there was a sense the election was lost. And, if that money had come in, it's almost certain that we would have won enough seats to have kept the House. So, yeah, this stuff affects behavior. It affects the passion of volunteers, right? I mean, think about it. If you're going to go out and work for Joe Biden or Donald Trump, right? If you think you're losing as opposed to winning, you're far more likely to do something else other than volunteer. You'll cook dinner for your family. You'll go on a vacation, right? If you think the enterprise you're part of is losing. And so Trump is playing this kind of game with all of us. It's very similar to the red wave game, which is that he's getting up every day and saying, God, the polls are unbelievable. Yeah. It's incredible.
He's talking about expanding the map into Minnesota right. and
it's just so
Brooklyn.
Comical. It's a psyop, right? Like, it's a complete psyop, because because a bunch of Republican operatives pulled off the red wave fiasco in 2022. It worked. There was no red wave, but they convinced the media that there was, and that affected the outcome of the election. So if it worked last time, let's do it again, right? I mean, the media seems to be having not gone through the level of self-reflection that it should be going over about what happened in 2022. And so Trump is in the midst of this enormous psyop. It's being supported now by a series of Republican polls that are going to bolster this notion that he's blowing it out. And the other thing I think you're going to see much more of coming from the Republican aligned polling is this idea that Kennedy is like actually pulling much more from Biden and is a much more serious threat to Biden than to Trump, even though there's a lot of polling showing the exact opposite, right? That Kennedy's actually pulling more from Trump than from Biden. I mean, I view Kennedy at this point in the election as sort of, it's he's Frankenstein's monster, right? Like the monster's coming back and is potentially going to eat Dr. Frankenstein a little bit here. And so, but we'll see. I mean, it's still very early and we don't know and about it. But I do think that people should realize that the central argument that Donald Trump is making about the 2024 election is that he's winning and the election's over and there's no reason to have an election, basically. And there is no other argument. He doesn't have a policy agenda. He doesn't, he's not really campaigning on all these things. And yes, Biden sucks and the economy's bad. But the genesis of his brand architecture is that I'm winning the election, I'm strong, Biden's losing the election, he's weak, which is why they're going to invest so much energy in maintaining what is, in my mind, a fiction that he's actually ahead in the election right now.
What polls, you mentioned these Republican polls. I mean, if we can't trust the New York Times Siena poll, which you would assume you could trust the New York Times, like what polls should we ignore? Like what are just patently
I think
polls?
Listen, the way I like to say it, and I think anyone who's a data person would say, is that more data is better data, right? Like that, it's better to look at everything. I don't look at averages. I don't believe that averages are, and, I already explained to you how averages can be misleading. Let me give you another example of this, right? So let's say there are 5 polls showing Biden ahead by 1 and 1 poll showing Trump ahead by 6, right? The average of that will put Trump ahead.
Yeah.
Even though 5 out of the 6 polls have Biden ahead.
Anyone who's ever gotten a 0 on a test.
Right, exactly. Right, understands the math here, right? There's some really kind of, and I know there's a lot of English majors and political science majors and not a lot of math, but I was a math kid and, I was a math and chess nerd growing up. And so, I spent a lot of time with numbers and data and logic. And I will just tell you that so the way I like to think about this is that the best way to do it is to look at everything and try to establish patterns and see patterns. And the patterns that I think we've seen so far, I think the most interesting data to me so far in the last month, the new data that we have, is that Biden is now continually doing much better among likely voters than Trump is in the independent polls. And, in the ABC poll, in the Marist poll, the NPR Marist poll, very high quality, large sample poll. Trump's up 2 with adults. Biden's up 1 with registered voters. Biden's up 5 with likely voters. And why does that matter, right? What do we take away from that? And we've now seen this replicated in many polls because pollsters have just started moving from adults and registered voters to likely voters, because you do that late in the cycle, right? Because about 80% of people who are registered end up voting. And so it's a different audience, right? It's a different universe, and every election that universe is different. So you can't. There's art in this. But there's also, there's science in this. There's also a little bit of art, and people make decisions, and they have different ways of grading or determining somebody who's a likely voter. However, we're getting new data, and the fact that Biden is consistently up with likely voters, and coupled with that Trump was underperforming public polling in virtually every one of the battleground states that polled, and that Trump is also failing to prevent the Nikki Haley 15, 20, 25%, is all part of the same understanding to me. And what that understanding is that as people are getting closer to voting and moving from being disinterested to likely to voting, Trump and the Republicans are losing ground. And this is what happened throughout 2022, where we dramatically overperformed public polling, right? It's what happened in 2023. We did far better in places like Wisconsin and Ohio and Virginia than we thought we were going to. It's what happened in New York 3. The public polling had us there ahead by a point or 2 or 3, and we won by 8. It's the same thing. It's the same dynamic. And that dynamic is that when people have to go pull the lever for MAGA, they don't want to do it. Some chunk of Republicans, I think that my basic understanding of the election is that when Dobbs happened, that a chunk of the Republican Party became loosened from the Republican Party because it was a sign the party had just gone too far, that the MAGA takeover was becoming too dangerous and too crazy. And that manifests for people in different ways, right? That idea of going too far. But what we've seen is that since Dobbs, we've overperformed and they've struggled. It happened in 2022. It happened in 23. It's showing up, the same exact dynamic is showing up in 2024. And one of the other ways it's manifesting is in the hard dollar fundraising crisis that exists in the Republican Party from Trump on down to the candidates. Because it's my view that part of what's happened is that the hard dollar fundraising base, the people that wrote the $500 checks, the $1,000 checks for Republicans, they were non-MAGA Republicans. They were traditional conservative establishment Republicans, Bush people, right? Nikki Haley people. And those people feel alienated from the MAGA-led Republican Party. And they're holding back votes, they're holding back money. And so what we also enter in my calculation about where we are is polling is even, but there's starting to emerge a very significant gap between how much money we're raising and the size and capacity of our organizational power and the raging, unbelievable dumpster fire that is the Republican Party and the Trump campaign. We've never seen this kind of imbalance and since I've been in this business since the late 1980s, where we have somewhere between a 3 to 4 to 1 cash on hand advantage over Trump right now. There's never been that kind of imbalance in the modern age of politics. It's always much closer. And our national campaign is moving. We've got offices open, staff hired, people are executing, they're doing press releases, they're fighting, right? There is no Trump campaign. They don't have anybody,
I have heard Charlie Kirk. That's one thing where he has tried to sound the alarm that Republicans do not have the state, local, campaign offices to Biden.
And it's too late. The thing to realize that it's too late. They can't, it's like building a battleship, right? You can't construct something. You can't make up for the lost time. And they don't have enough money to do it, by the way. I mean, you could arguably throw a lot of money at it, but you can't do it here. And the second thing that I think is if I were a Republican, I think there are two other things that I'd be very concerned about as this thing moves forward. The second thing is that the rebellion that is happening. I mean, to have Cheney and Mike Pence and Romney and Paul Ryan and the many, many other Republicans underneath this and the Never Trumper movement, right? The Never Trumper movement is going to be more visible and potent and powerful than it was in previous elections, creating a more powerful permission structure for the Haley type voters to not vote for Trump and maybe vote for Biden. I mean, imagine if Mitt Romney and campaigns with Joe Biden at the end of the election. I don't know that will happen, but we can't rule it out, right? And then the other thing I would be worried about, and this is if I were Republicans, is that there are 6 things that voters are going to come to learn about Donald Trump in the next few months that they don't know about him or didn't know about him in 2020. And, I've watched the campaign argue that basically all of Trump's negatives are kind of baked into the cake. There's not a single person I know that believes that is true on our side. And let me explain what those 6 things are that people are going to come to learn. That Donald Trump raped E. Jean Carroll in a department store dressing room. Number 2 is that he oversaw one of the largest financial frauds in American history. He's been fined hundreds of millions of dollars for it, and he and his 2 sons have been banned from doing significant amounts of business in New York State. 3, that he stole America's secrets. He lied to the FBI about it. He shared those secrets with other people. It is, without question, the greatest betrayal of the country by a former president in all of our history. 4th is that he led an insurrection against the United States, tried to overturn a legitimate election. He led an armed attack on the Capitol, and he's now promised to finish the job if he gets into the Oval Office in January 2025 and end American democracy for all time. 5th, that he and his family have corruptly taken more money from foreign governments than any family in American history. Jared Kushner just announced this week that he's doing a multi-$100 million real estate deal in Serbia with the pro-Russian government of Serbia. He's got a big bag open, and Russian-aligned forces are just tossing cash in there to the Trump family. 6th is that he singularly is responsible for ending Roe and stripping the rights and freedoms away of more than half the population of the United States. Any one of those 6 things is going to be very, very difficult for Donald Trump to overcome. He has to overcome all 6. And I don't think he has the political skill and capacity to do so. I think he's a diminished candidate on the stump. He's far more erratic and impulsive. He's making incredible mistakes on a regular basis, the kind of mistakes that candidates who lose elections make. And so, when I look at all this, and then the counter is that Joe Biden, I think, has been a good president and the country's better off. I mean, the Wall Street Journal just had an article where they interviewed economists and surveyed economists in the United States. And literally in the Wall Street Journal, the title of the article was, "The U.S. economy is the envy of the world," right? The Economist just had an article about the unprecedented startup boom in the United States. We have the lowest uninsured rate in American history, the best job market since the 1960s, the best economic recovery of any G7 country in the world. Inflation's lower here than any G7 country in the world. I can go on and on and on. I think Joe Biden's going to have the ability to say, you elected me for one central reason, which is to get us to the other side of COVID, to get us back to a place of normalcy. I've done that. And here's what I want to do in the second term. And so when I look at all this, I feel confident that when the troops are fully engaged on the battlefield, right, we have better arguments, a better candidate, better organization, more money, and they've got Trump. And who would want to be betting the future of any enterprise on that guy?
All right, let's take a quick break. And I just want to encourage you, if you like what we do here, please go to patreon.com/Matt Lewis and support us. There's also some cool merch you can get. We've got a coffee mug that, frankly, I love. I use all the time. And an autographed copy of one of my books, like Too Dumb to Fail or Filthy Rich Politicians. And of course, the most important part, you'll be helping us do what we do here. Thank you in advance, and let's get back to the show. Well, let me run 3 things by you that are somewhat related that I think push back slightly on this.
Yeah.
And there may be
that's why we're here, right?
And you may be able to poke some holes in this. I'd love if you do. That would be just fine. One, Biden comes out and says, "Let's debate." To me, that suggested he's at least a little worried about the polling, that he came out and said, "Let's do the debate." 2, I believe that New York Times Siena poll showed that although Biden is losing in those Sun Belt swing states, the Democrats running for U.S. Senate are winning, which leads me to believe it's not a polling problem. It's not a Democratic problem. It's a Joe Biden problem. And then lastly, the whole Israel thing. I agree with you that there are a lot of like Nikki Haley, never Trump Republicans out there. I don't think Biden did himself any favors with that, recent statement about not supporting Israel if they go into Rafah. Let's tackle. That's a bunch to throw at you.
Yeah, let's go through it one by one. I have a different take on the debate thing, is that I think Biden wants to debate Trump because he wants to win the election. Right? And he wants to make sure that Trump 2024 is seen by voters this time. And that we know from our polling, right, that there's become a little bit of like, not nostalgia about Trump, but that some of the rougher edges of Trump have been sort of forgotten a little bit. And so in a campaign, what you do with a campaign is you want to tell voters the good things about you and the not so good things about the other guy, right? That's what a campaign is for. And I think there was worry that Trump wasn't going to debate. He skipped the 3rd debate last time. He skipped every Republican debate. And so what they did was they came up with a strategy which said, how do we want to conduct the debates, right, on our terms? And let's see if Trump will agree to it. And if he locks into it, then he has to show up. And that we'd rather know in June that he's not going to show up than in late September. And so they did what I thought was like an incredibly brilliant kind of strategic move, which is that they've really locked Trump into 2 debates. Both of them are going to happen before the early vote. Remember, early vote starts on September 20th. I mean, it's hard to believe. I mean, the election begins in 4 months from now. And the campaign made it very clear as they wanted to have as many debates as possible before the early vote began. That's not a campaign that is hesitant or scared. That's a confident campaign. They want to put these things in front of voters before they start voting. They're not trying to hide, right? They actually want this debate. They're showing confidence and strength. And they offered a schedule that was, for whatever reasons that we don't know, right, was one that they wanted, and they got it.
I agree with you. Yeah. I agree with you that it was a coup the way that Biden defined the rules and the terms of the debate.
Right.
But my gut is that the Biden folks would rather be winning by 5 or 10 points
Yeah,
and
but we're
saying,
not. But we're not.
we're not gonna debate this guy.
Right.
We don't think the
Right.
president of the United
Right.
States
Right.
needs to be on the stage with someone
Right.
who
But that's not
started a
where we are,
coup. And
Matt, that's not where we are, right? It's a close
true.
competitive election. So they made I think, a pragmatic decision that they want to debate Trump. And so that's coming from a place of strength and confidence, not a place of weakness, right? I mean, I think if they were scared and worried, then they would have ducked the debates. They brought this up. They decided to engage. And I think
If
what they
you were
also
debating
did,
Trump, I would be
yeah.
very confident. I am not as.
But let me just tell you. But the
I
other
don't know
thing
that Biden could get through those 6 things.
I know, but I don't know that he's going to. That's not his job at that debate. That's my job, and that's the outside groups. But what I will say is that I think the other thing to keep in mind about these debates is that if our theory of the case is that when people wake up to the election and they start going through that process of becoming disinterested to interested to likely voter to voter, that we gain ground, then waking everybody up earlier in the process is strategically important. And that's what they just did, right? We're going to have a debate now just in 5 weeks. The general election's here. There's going to be no avoiding it. We're waking up everybody to the fact that there's a national debate. And we think that we will improve, that this will push the election in our favor. We'll find out. I mean, I think there's just generally a belief that Trump, because I think the other thing that we showed, and this is part of the theory of the case as well, is that Trump's impulsivity is a huge problem for him. His impulsivity is much higher. He's lost in whether this is cognitive decline, whatever it's going to be. And what they did is they tested this in this exchange. And Trump demonstrated his lack of control in the way that he just took the 2 things we threw out there. I'm going to do it. No going back to the campaign, no consulting, no trying to negotiate, right? Like an impulsive idiot. He just engaged, and he responded to, not even to Joe Biden, or I guess it was Biden did do a video on it. And so I think that was also a test of their goading him. And, this was an important moment in not the 2 candidates, but in the campaigns themselves. And the Biden campaign, in my own view, had a really big win on this debate thing. They tried, and it took a risk. It was experimental. They didn't know what was going to happen. They got more than they ever could have imagined. And I think, it was telling to me that the acting chairman of the Republican Party, Sean Hannity, immediately came out and denounced this decision because he feels that Trump got taken to the cleaners. And I think you're going to try to see them wiggle out. I am deeply skeptical that Trump shows up in June. I'm deeply skeptical. We'll see what happens. Second question was, we'll get to Gaza.
These
at the
states,
end.
the candidates running for the U.S. Senate
I think if you look at all of the data that's available to us right now, and you essentially said it, is that we're holding our own in all the Senate races. The early polling we have in the House is very encouraging for us. The congressional generic has now moved into consistently positive territory, which was an important measure for me in 2022. And so the structure of the race is actually feels very favorable to Democrats, right? Below Biden. We'll come to Biden in a second. None of our Senate candidates are behind. No one is in trouble. The Republicans are having another cycle of bad candidate problems in the battleground. I mean, they have some truly bad candidates. And I think, and we also, as I went through earlier, we have, I think, significant financial and organizational advantages. So the structure of the race feels pretty okay for us right now. And I also think one of the things that's going to emerge is that the bad candidate problems that Republicans are going to have in North Carolina and in Arizona, Kari Lake and Mark Robinson, could be the thing that determines the outcome of this election. I would not want to bet any money on Republicans winning the presidential in Arizona and in North Carolina, given Robinson and Kari Lake and what an unbelievable drag they're going to be on the Republican ticket in both those states. I think that this bad candidate problem, as we euphemistically call it, right, could actually dictate the outcome of the Electoral College. And I've personally raised and invested a lot of time and money in Arizona and North Carolina for this reason, because I think there's extraordinary opportunity there based on the titanic awfulness of the Republicans at the top of the ticket there. And so if I'm correct here, right, that structurally this race feels still a little bit Democratic, is it likely that those voters in some of these polls that are supporting Trump, but also supporting Ruben Gallego or Josh Stein or Alyssa Slotkin, where do they go? Do they stay as, Trump plus Democrat in the Senate? Man, I wouldn't want to be Republican betting on that happening. Because if they don't like Kari Lake, why are they going to like Donald Trump? And if they don't like Mark Robinson, why are they going to like Donald Trump? They're the same. And, and so I think that if again, I go back to this basic idea that in those scenarios, right, the likely outcome is more favorable to us. It doesn't mean it'll happen, right?
But what do you make of, as of now, what do you make of the fact that Biden, why would a person who takes a survey in Arizona say they're voting for Trump and
Ruben
Gallego?
Yeah, I don't think that's a sustainable position. I mean, what I'm saying is that I think that's the position of people very early in the process who haven't really seriously engaged in thinking through all this. It would be very unusual to have that level of ticket splitting that we're seeing in some of these states. And so I think it's unlikely that it sustains over time as people go through the process of becoming a likely voter. Remember that in virtually every one of these state polls that have been done, there are registered voters. And if Biden is opening up, if Biden's doing 2 to 3 points better with likely voters, then our understanding of what's happening in the battleground is not accurate, right? Because if the likely voter universe is 2 to 3 points more Democratic and more Biden than the registered voter universe, and remember, look, just last week, right? Orbital Digital, a Republican polling firm based in Phoenix, right? Arizona-based Republican polling firm had Biden up 1 in their statewide poll. And that's what I mean. Like, people have to we're relying too much on data that is inherently unreliable and so, in Arizona, we have polls showing us ahead. We have polls showing us behind. In Michigan, we have polls showing us ahead. We have polls showing us behind, right? Like, and so where is it? It's just soft and mushy. And a lot of people are soft and mushy because I do think that one of the reasons I think people will stay soft and mushy longer is that they don't necessarily want this to be a Trump-Biden race, right? They wanted a different race. And they're coming kicking and screaming into this race. But this is the race they have. And Robert Kennedy's not an acceptable alternative. I mean, he's kind of a freak show. And I don't see him, being a serious alternative for most people. And I think it's why we're sort of quietly confident that when people go through this process of wandering around to like having to pull the lever, every time we've gone through that process since Dobbs, things have been better for us than public polling. I want to remind everybody, Trump in 2024 underperformed public polling in every state that had polling in the Republican primary audience, with the exception of one, and I forget which state it was. So in 2024, Trump's underperforming polling, not overperforming polling. Will that change in the general? Maybe. You want to bet the farm on that, given that we've now had a live fire test of Trump going in front of voters and underperforming repeatedly among voters that are supposed to be his? Deeply worrisome stuff, I think, emerging on the Republican side. And obviously, look, then we get to number 3, Israel-Gaza. There just isn't a lot of evidence that this is going to be a voting issue for a large number of people. And nor should it be, frankly. I mean, traditionally, the issues that drive the election are healthcare, the economy, and then if there's a war where America's, soldiers are fighting and dying, right? Or if there's some deep security threat that makes us feel uncertain, right? Those kinds of things can move into the upper tier. In 2020, the number one issue was COVID, because it was a material threat to all of us, and it was more important to voters than the economy. That's unusual, right? And even in that Harvard IOP poll, and I'll just talk about our side for a second, that Harvard IOP poll, they gave 18 to 29-year-olds 16 choices of what's the most important issue. Israel-Gaza was 15th. In the Axios poll of college students done 2 weeks ago, they gave people 10 choices of what's the most important issue. Israel-Gaza was 10 out of 10. And I'm not surprised by that, because you can have an opinion about Israel-Gaza, but that doesn't mean it's important to you, right? And I just don't think there's a lot of data today suggesting that this is going to be a voting issue for a large number of people. And what you have to keep in mind about polling, right? This is another area where polling can be misleading, is just because people have an opinion about something doesn't mean that it's actually going to drive their vote. And it's called saliency in polling, right? There's usually only 2, 3, 4 issues that really drive people's votes, right? That really matter to people enough that it will change the direction of where they're going, as opposed to having an opinion about something. And so the way I view Israel-Gaza is that it's an important issue, but there are just issues that matter more to people. And I would be surprised that if it's going to be an important issue for more than a very small number of people, this idea that this is going to interfere, given that, Joe Biden can make the case very easily that no American president has done more for Israel than Joe Biden. And I think that's actually an indisputable case. He was there during wartime. The Republicans held up the funding for 6 months. He negotiated and got it done over the objections of many in his own party. We have a very strong case to make here. And this notion that somehow by Biden holding up a single shipment of arms to send out kind of a warning shot across Bibi's bow, was somehow being disloyal to Israel, I find it to be ridiculous personally. And so I think we can fight this out. For those people that these things matter, I think we have a better argument in front of us than is currently understood. And we'll see if we end up getting to the point where we make that case during the election.
All right, one last question.
Yep.
And this speaks to the hopium brand, which I think began as a slur.
Yeah, it did.
And like a lot of great names, you kind of owned it and rebranded it, co-opted the term. Is there anything you could see in the polling? Can you imagine if you started seeing this in the polling that you would then say, look, I'm wrong. I've been wrong about this. It's time to hit the panic button. Is there anything that you could see in the polling, or is it the case that you just believe that the fundamentals are solid for Biden and the polling isn't necessarily reflecting the reality?
No, I think my basic view is that we're the higher seed in the tournament. We're the better team, but we still have to go win the game, right? I mean, victory is not guaranteed. And, campaigns are hard. I mean, the candidate's got to perform, the campaign's got to perform, right? I mean, there's a big election ahead of us that hasn't really begun yet. And it's just having gone through these elections, been part of this for a long time, I feel like we're fine, right? Could we be better? Of course we could, right? We could be ahead by 10 points, but we're not. But we're not behind. We're not trailing. We're not struggling. Actually, on one of the most important measures of the health of a political party or a candidate, money and organization, we have a wild imbalance, much greater imbalance than exists in the polling. And then at the end of the day, over 6 months or 5.5 months, that may determine the outcome of the election far more than any of these polls at this point, right? Because it's how much force do you have behind you as you execute? How strong is the team underneath you as you execute? I also think the debates were important for us. I think we needed the debates. And I think there was concern that he was not going to show. And so the Biden campaign, because he doesn't show up at debates, right? This is like a pattern, right? He didn't show up for a single Republican debate in the primaries. I think the Biden campaign made a calculation. The election's close, and they would, on balance, they want to debate him, and they want to debate him as soon as possible. And that's what we're going to do. I think that was also helpful and structurally helpful to us. I think, we had very good economic news in the last few weeks, right? Inflation was down, and the economy is continuing to be, we had the Dow's broken 40,000. And, psychologically, right, for voters, there are large numbers of voters who understand the strength of the economy based on what they're seeing with Wall Street, right? And not necessarily what they're feeling in their pocketbook, but this idea that while people are making money, things are good, right? And then finally, I guess, one of the things we didn't we're just talking about the economy. There's something I write about a lot in Hopium, but I haven't talked about it today, that in terms of the other things that make me optimistic. I'm not listen, no one can predict the future. I have no idea what's going to happen this election. Things change all the time, and we have debates now. We didn't have those a week ago, right? Is that, to me, the most significant data that's come out of all the polling in the last few months was in the Wall Street Journal polling of the battleground states. And they asked the question, in the last 2 years in the 7 states, are things better? And in every state, it was like between 15 and 30 points. People said things were better. How hard is it for us to be able to say then in these states, well, things are better because of Joe Biden, right?
They must believe things are better here, but somewhere else they're really bad, right?
Right, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Right? I'm okay with that. I would rather them, if they felt like things were bad where they were, that's friggin' hard to convince them things are better. If they think things are better where they are, having Democratic governors and Democratic elected officials helping explain that, hey, you know how well we're doing here in Arizona? Well, that's because of Joe Biden's economic policies. That's like not super hard, Matt. Like that's not the hardest thing that anybody's ever done. I think putting lipstick on the Trump pig and selling that's really hard, right? I don't know that selling this idea, if people innately feel that in their communities, things are better. Isn't that Joe Biden's entire argument, right? That he's made things better. And so we have a lot to work with there. And you know what I mean? And I think this notion that Republicans stick on so much, which is that people are down on the economy, like the issue of the approval rating in the last cycle, people are spending too much time on one piece of a broad set of data. Even in that New York Times poll, what may have been the most consequential data coming out of that poll was they asked about life satisfaction, which is not a common question on polling. But 74% said they were satisfied with their lives and 24% said not satisfied in that New York Times poll. We have lots of other data showing that people have incredibly high levels of job satisfaction and income satisfaction. If there was broad discontent in America, we would not have been winning the elections that we've been winning all across the country for the last 2 years. There isn't broad discontent, but there is a sense that something's gone wrong with the collective, with the with the country. I think we all agree with that. Right? I mean, Democrats think it's because of Republicans, and Republicans think it's because of Democrats. And so I think that data is not as salient to me and as prescriptive as the question about whether things are better where you are. And I will tell you, I think that data should be scary to Republicans because it doesn't take, James Carville cross George Stephanopoulos cross Karl Rove to figure out how to say if you think things are better, it's because of us. I mean, imagine if those numbers were negative, then we'd have a really hard time. So I think that, look, anything can happen in this race. I would much rather be us than them. But what people have to anticipate is the election's going to change. What happened in 2016, the polls weren't wrong. The election changed at the end. James Comey changed the election. And this election is going to go through many, many changes and many evolutions, many chapters over the next 5.5 months. And so the next time I come back, we may be describing a completely different election, right? Trump could be ahead by 5 points. Biden could be ahead by 5 points. Who the hell knows, right? We have no, polling can't tell you anything about 3 months from now, 6 months from now. It can't even tell you anything about tomorrow. All it can do is tell you about today. It has no predictive value whatsoever because things change. And the one thing we know, Matt, is things are going to change. And that's why you got to have me back to discuss those changes.
Always, my friend. How can people read your stuff?
Yeah, I'm on Substack. It's free. It's called Hopium Chronicles. You can just go to the site and read it every day. Or if you want to subscribe for free to the newsletter, you can do that on the site. And then if you want to become a paid member, you get a little bit more. But I try to keep most of my content free to make it easily accessible to folks. We've built a great community. And if you're a Democrat who's listening who also wants to learn how to do what we call do more, worry less, and work on the campaigns to sort of assuage your concerns and your anxiety to go make yourself busy. And by helping Democrats win, we have lots of ways of doing that too, under the category of do more, worry less. That's what we do at Hopium, is that we don't fret, we don't get nervous, we just go to work. Because what Hopium is, at Hopium, is hope with a plan. We just don't hope that the election's going to turn out well. We do the work to make it so. And so if you want to be part of a community of doers who are helping make sure that we win these elections, come hang out. The water's warm. We got a great community over there.
Very cool. Always a pleasure. Simon Rosenberg, thanks for coming back on.
Yeah, thank you so much. Keep up the good work, brother.